Hello there. So today I'd like to talk to you about one of my favorite philosophers and perhaps one of the most inspirational philosophers that I've come across. His name is Giovanni Pico della Mirandola. And he obviously is Italian philosopher from the Italian Renaissance. He was born in 1463. He died in 1494. I want to talk about his life a little bit, but I'm going to try to get this whole talk done in 1 hour. So I'll be as brief and concise as I can. But I do think in this case, it's nice to know a little bit of his life. I won't go through all of his works. There was not an enormous amount of works because he died at the young age of 31. So he's like a comet in the sky. But an extraordinary human being, an incredible thinker, and perhaps one of the most representative philosophers from that last great age, the way I see it, the Italian Renaissance. So Giovanni was born, as I said, in 1463 in a city named Mirandola. Della Mirandola means from Mirandola. It's near Modena in Italy. He was the younger son in a family of feudal lords, so he was a count, and these feudal lords then ruled a small territory in Mirandola in northern Italy. What's extraordinary about him is his education, and at a very early age, he received his humanistic training. Let me just say this about the Renaissance. Most people know the word Renaissance means rebirth. But then if you ask them, or what was reborn, usually people are at a loss to know what was reborn. Some people say the arts or something, but art has been around. No, what was reborn was the great achievement of the ancient Greeks and Romans, which had sort of fallen by the wayside and bypassed during the Middle Ages. In fact, some of the thinkers of the Renaissance called the Middle Ages the Dark Ages because they believed that learning sort of fell by the wayside. And so there was this rebirth of learning, and texts were being translated. There was this incredible profusion of art. And Italy was the center of the Italian Renaissance. Then it spread to the north, and there's Shakespeare and so on. It spread throughout Europe. So this was a great time, and it lasted only like 2.5 centuries. So his thinking is very representative of the Renaissance. It's sort of like a microcosm of the Renaissance. But back to his life then. So he was destined then for a career in the church and being influenced by his parents. And so he began to study canon law in Bologna. The University of Bologna is like the oldest university in the world, well, next to the academy, the oldest modern university where Galileo taught. So in 1477, Pico was 14 years old. 2 years later, he began his study of philosophy at the University of Ferrara, which he continued at the University of Padua between 1480 and 1482. And so from his 17th to his 19th birthday, he was studying philosophy. After a number of journeys that took him to Paris and then repeatedly to Florence, which was one of the centers of the Italian Renaissance, he began to study Hebrew and Arabic. So by that time, he had become fluent in Latin and Greek, and of course, all the classics from Latin and Greek. And now he's studying Arabic and Hebrew, to study the Old Testament and the Jewish tradition and the great scholars of the Middle East. In 1486, and so this is what I wanted to lead up to, at the age of 23, he composed 900 theses, offering to defend them in Rome the following year at a public disputation to which he invited all the scholars, the great scholars from all of Europe. But before this event could take place, some of Pico's theses were objected by the Pope Innocent VIII. So Pope Innocent VIII, hearing of this disputation that Pico declared, appointed a committee to have these theses examined. Well, 7 of the theses were condemned as unorthodox, and 6 more were declared dubious. So Pico published a defense of his theses, and in this retaliation, the Pope then decided to condemn all 900 theses. With this, Pico signed an act of submission, but the act of submission did not establish Pico's innocence, so he fled to France to escape from the papal authorities. But if you think about this, it was all his doing. I mean, he didn't have to, throw his gloves down and declare a disputation, right? He did this out of his own integrity. So in 1488, at the age of 25, which is pretty young, he was arrested in France and by the papal envoys, but with the help of several Italian princes, he was released from prison by King Charles VII. Upon his release, he returned to Italy and was allowed by the Pope to settle in Florence under parole, under the personal protection of this powerful man in Italy, Lorenzo de' Medici. And that's a whole story in itself there. Except a few trips then, short visits to Ferrara, Pico spent the remainder of his life in Florence, and he wrote his most important works there. During this time, Pico remained in close touch with the circle of the Medici family and with this important Plato scholar and original thinker himself. His name was Ficino, which is he's not one of the giant stars like Aristotle, but one of the very important Italian Renaissance Neoplatonists. In 1493, at the age of 30, he was acquitted of all ecclesiastical censors and restrictions by Alexander VI, and he died in 1494 at the early age of 31, at the very day when Charles VII of France made his entry into Florence after the expulsion of Pietro de' Medici. That's just a little capsule of a great man's life, but very young, like a star in the night sky. He, like a comet, and he just burns out at 31. I won't go through all of his works. They're not that many, but I mean, given his short life, he wrote on all kinds of things. A defense of, for example, of his theses. Probably one of the most philosophical is called, and all of these were written in Latin, of course, on the one and the many, which is his metaphysics. He wrote on the on Genesis and many other things. But the book that's become most famous was this introduction to these 900 theses that he had. And it came to be called Oration on the Dignity of Man. Now, why is it an oration? Well, I feel very strongly about this. One of the traditions that came out of the Italian Renaissance, which was a rebirth of the great achievement of the Greeks and Romans, was oratory or classical rhetoric. And that, the very word rhetoric has now gotten a pejorative meaning. Ever since the dawning of the Enlightenment, people just say, well, that's a bunch of rhetoric, like it's a bunch of hot air. And there are reasons why that's happened. But in reality, the truth of the whole big story about the history of classical rhetoric is that there's such a thing as sophistical rhetoric, where these sophists in ancient Greece, for example, who are not concerned about truth or what is right and just persuasion, then that Plato attacks that actually, and that has its own history all the way to modern times, all the way to contemporary times. But there's another tradition that's a treasure trove, and it's called classical rhetoric. And the way people expressed themselves during the Renaissance was, for the most part, through rhetoric. Now, rhetoric differs from purely regular prose in that there's a profuse use of metaphor and simile, of all kinds of different, what they call tropes, different turns of phrases. And there's this reliance on the image as well as the concept. And so you're going to, when you read Pico, you'll see that there's this profuse use of metaphor, of simile, of tropes in terms of phrases. Because the rhetoricians believe that a human being, if you're going to convince someone, then you need to convince their whole being. Actually, the word convince, vincere, is the root of my very name, Vincenzo. It means to conquer, to win. And con means with. So if you're going to convince someone, you have to conquer the whole person. So a human being is not just an intellect, but we have passions, and we have a sense of esteem and self-respect and respect for virtue. So the rhetoricians believed that if you want to convince someone, you need to convince their mind, their spirit, and their sense of dignity. So they believed if you're going to convince someone, you have to give arguments, that's logos. You have to appeal to their passions, that's called pathos. And you have to embody ethos, which is to have excellence of character. You have to be perceived as being someone who possesses excellence of character or virtue, somebody that whose words can be relied upon and who practices what they preach. So that's called ethos, pathos, and logos. Logos are the arguments, pathos are the appeal to feelings, and ethos is how the audience or whomever is listening perceives you. And usually classical rhetoric is expressed in the spoken word. It's spoken. Oratory is usually spoken, although it can be expressed in the written word as well. So we have with Pico's Oration on the Dignity of Man, a piece of classical rhetoric right from the heart of the Italian Renaissance, and he uses every ploy necessary to convince the whole person. And it's become one of the most representative, as I said, and most famous documents from the Italian Renaissance. I think there are three main themes in the oration, and it speaks directly to our question about human nature. Although it approaches human nature in perhaps one of the most unorthodox approaches in all philosophy. So the first thesis that's going to animate this whole oration is this: that human beings were created without a fixed nature. So that the answer to human nature is that there is no human nature, unless by human nature you mean that humans are undetermined beings. So we don't have a fixed nature. So what are we then? We have the seeds of all inanimate things, water, fire, the whole inorganic world. If you think about it, our temperature is a lot hotter than the rest of the organic world, except for fire, right? We have water. Most of our body is made of water. Our very cells are made of stardust. That's the earth. Our breath is the wind. All the elements are composed in our bodies. But we also have a mind, we have an intellect, and we have spirit. And so everything in our bodies is in this universe. We are a microcosm of the macrocosm. So we contain the seeds of all the beings, all the animals, all the plants, and all the celestial beings. This is what Pico thought. But his first thesis, let's just keep it very simple, that human beings were created without a fixed nature. So humans are the undetermined being, okay? That's, if we have a nature, then that nature is to be undetermined. Now that's an important point. And that's very unorthodox. Usually philosophers give the nature of man or humans. Now the second thesis, and this is why it's called Oration on the Dignity of Man. The dignity of humans, by the way, you know the word man means human. It's a translation of homo, which means human, but it's masculine, so it came to be called man. And during that time, when they wanted to refer to all humans, they say man, but it's not just gender. It's not just men. Okay, so the dignity of humans consists in our power to freely cultivate ourselves into higher and higher forms to the point of being reborn. And he means this word reborn in the theological sense, but also in every other sense. Reborn into the highest level, which is divine. So Pico, in the end, becomes a mystic. He believes that it's possible for humans to cultivate themselves and raise up Jacob's ladder, as it were, all the way beyond the angels, beyond God even. Now that sounds blasphemous, but he doesn't mean beyond God, not literally. He means beyond the God that appears to most humans as a being, and into the Godhead, which is really the true God. So usually the mystics speak of the Godhead or the God above God to distinguish their view of God from the traditional view of God. It's really God, but it's a deeper understanding of God as the source of all beings and not as a being. So this is what constitutes the dignity of man, of humans, to be able to freely cultivate whatever seeds they choose into higher and higher forms until finally into the Godhead, into epoptia, what he calls, which is mystical union with divinity. And then the third thesis, and this is very edifying, I think, because a lot of people don't really understand the value of the liberal arts. The liberal arts, he claims, are the primary vehicles through which human beings are able to cultivate themselves. So when we say education, Pico means liberal education. By the way, liberal education doesn't have anything to do with liberal versus conservative. It's not liberal because the Democrats believe in it or anything like that. The word liberal means liberating. It has two meanings, really. Liberated from the professions, from like business or any of the other applied sciences and so on, medicine. But it also means liberated from any kind of mental constraints, because one can think critically and one can then govern oneself. So this is called the liberal arts. And usually the liberal arts have to do with the pure sciences, like all the natural sciences, and the humanities. And the word humanities is usually used in all kinds of ways today. And what I like to do is be conservative about the word humanities. And for me, I was taught, and it seems to me accurate to say that the humanities means philosophy, theology, history, and literature. When I just use that, whenever I speak of the humanities, it's those four disciplines. And with literature goes classical rhetoric, and with philosophy goes logic and so on. Okay, so the liberal arts then, that's the third theme, are the primary vehicles. So let me just give some clarity about what he means about those three things. I'll just give you an overview of Pico's conception of the dignity of man in general, and then I'll go through these three topics that I just mentioned. So Pico's Oration, in which his doctrine of the dignity of man is developed, is the most widely known document of early Renaissance thought. I said that. Now, for Pico, humans and our dignity are often exalted by the early humanists. Okay, so the main school of thought during the Renaissance was called humanism. And there was Neoplatonism, Neo-Aristotelianism, which are the two great giants from the ancient Greek world. And they usually exalted the great dignity of humans in different ways. And that's why they were called humanists. The topic was taken up by another Renaissance humanist, I told you, was a friend of Pico, namely Ficino. And well, actually, let me take that back. I'm not sure if he was actually a friend, but he was older, and I'm not sure if they lived contemporaneously. But another philosopher, Ficino, assigned the great dignity of the human soul because of our privileged place in the center of this universal hierarchy, and humans then represented the bond between the corporeal world, that is the material world, and the celestial world. But in his oration, well, let me tell you a little bit more about Ficino first, and then we can see how Pico deviated from that a little bit, or a lot actually. You see, the idea of beings during the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance was God was the creator. And then there's this hierarchy of angels, like the highest angels make like even a hierarchy. The three, and Pico will talk about these three highest angels, and then beneath the angels comes this hierarchy of humans, and then beneath the humans, the whole animal kingdom. Beneath the animals, then plants. Beneath the plants, the inorganic world, and then beneath the inorganic world were even demons. So all the way from demons all the way up to the angels. These are all creatures, and then God is the creator. But humans, for Ficino, humans then are this bond between the angelical world, which is celestial, and the corporeal world, which is material. So and because of that, then, we sort of, humans are the bond between heaven and earth. Okay, we constitute the horizon, as it were. But in his oration, Pico went beyond Ficino. Unlike Ficino, Pico did not discuss the question merely in passing, as in the context of larger questions, as Ficino did, but discussed it directly and displaced it prominently in the opening section of his short, eloquent Oration. Furthermore, unlike Ficino, who thought of man's dignity lies in our ability to contemplate universals. See, because for Ficino, since we form this bond between heaven and earth, then we're able to contemplate universal truth, even the one being. And that's what constitutes our great dignity. That idea takes a while to sink into us. These philosophical ideas sometimes take time to germinate. Think about that. Humans can contemplate being itself, the very origin of all things. So we can contemplate universal. And in that sense, we've formed this bond between heaven and earth. But Pico, on the other hand, lays the accent on humans' freedom. This is a great oration on freedom, and freedom thought in a deep way. In other words, instead of assigning to man a fixed, though privileged place in this universal hierarchy, Pico puts man entirely apart from this hierarchy and claims that humans are capable of occupying, according to our free choice, any degree of life from the lowest to the highest. And so God, understood by Pico as the supreme maker, declared. And so, consistent with being a good rhetorician, like I told you, with this copious use of metaphor, Pico then devises this dialogue between God and Adam. And of course, Adam is going to represent humans. The first man represents humans. And so he just makes up this dialogue. But in this metaphor, this allegory, he places his threefold theses. And I find this to be quite impressive. So God says to man, creature of undeterminate image, we have given you, O Adam, no visage proper to yourself, nor any endowment properly your own, in order that whatever place, whatever gifts you may with premeditation select, these same you may have and possess through your own judgment and decision. The nature of all other creatures is defined and restricted within laws which we have laid down. You, by contrast, impeded by no such restrictions, may, by your own free will, to choose custody, to whose custody we have assigned you. You may trace for yourself the lines of your own nature. I have placed you at the very center of the world, so that from that vantage point you may with greater ease glance about you on all that the world contains. We have made you a creature neither of heaven nor of earth, neither mortal nor immortal, in order that you may, as your free and proud shaper of your own being, you may fashion yourself in the form you may prefer. It will be in your power to descend to the lower brutish forms of life. You will be able through your own decision to rise again to the superior orders whose life is divine. So that's quite impressive. What an expression of freedom, and how inspirational. So this is a most eloquent expression of the two most fundamental themes, the first two. He doesn't mention the liberal arts here yet, that are expanded and elaborated throughout the whole oration. First, that humans are created without a fixed nature. That's why he has God say to Adam, we have given you no visage proper to yourself. The nature of all other creatures is defined and restricted, and so on and so forth. I won't have to repeat all that. In my notes, when I wrote these notes earlier in my 34 years ago when I first got my position here at Walsh. And so I went through every little point that he makes that substantiates that first thesis, that humans were made without any essence. So to save time, I just won't repeat that. What was the second theme then? Well, that human dignity, and this is the key, our dignity, our most precious part of humanity lies in our ability to freely cultivate ourselves into higher and higher forms, to ascend, as it were, Jacob's ladder. You may, by your own free will, to whose custody we have assigned you, trace the lineaments of your own nature. And again, you may, as your free and proud shaper of your own being, fashion yourself into whatever form you may prefer. And you may descend to the lower brutish forms of life, where you'll be able to ascend to the supreme orders whose life is divine, all the way into the Godhead. And he's going to trace, he's going to trace how this may take place. The third major theme of Pico's oration, that the liberal arts are the primary vehicles through which human beings are able to cultivate our nature, can be found animating the whole oration. And he does this using metaphor. Later on in the oration, he says, the dignity of the liberal arts, which I am about to discuss, this is Pico talking now, and their value to us is attested not only by the Mosaic and Christian mysteries. Mosaic, that's the Old Testament. Christian, that's the New Testament. But also by the theologies of the most ancient times. He's talking about Plato, Aristotle, and the ancient pre-Socratic Greeks, who he read in the original language. What else is to be understood by the stages through which the initiates must pass in the mysteries of the Greeks? He's talking about the Greeks. The initiates, after being purified by the arts, which may be called expiatory. Now, this is something to think about. Expiatory means to eliminate something. Because one of the great ideas in Plato, for example, was that all the wisdom we need is already inside of our soul. And so through dialectic, through philosophical conversation, we're able to shed that ignorance. We're able to eliminate, take away whatever is blocking that. Like if I want the sunlight to come in, I need to open the shades. When I open the shades, the sunlight comes in as it's coming in now through the window. If I pull the shade, then the sunlight is blocked. Well, the sun is still shining. It's just that it can't shine in this room because the shades are pulled. So through dialectic, what Pico is saying, we're able to open the shades and let the sun shine through. So we need to eliminate whatever it is that's blocking this awareness of the divinity that resides within us. So this is the great power of dialectic, of philosophical conversation, and moral philosophy. So Pico is saying this is the cleansing, the purifying of the soul that the Greeks were talking about when they spoke of the cleansing power of dialectic and of moral philosophy. What could such admission mean but the interpretation of occult nature by means of philosophy? The word occult has nothing to do with spiritualism or anything like that. It just means secret. You know, we're translating here from the Latin. The translation is from the Latin. Only after they had been in this way prepared did they receive hypoptia. That is, the immediate vision of divine things by the light of theology. Okay, so theology and mystical theology become like the highest form of the liberal arts. So Pico establishes his dignity of the liberal arts and their value here. The dignity and value of the liberal arts, he says, which is attested by Mosaic, Christian, and ancient theologies, consists in their power. By the way, he mentioned the Old Testament, he mentioned Christianity, he mentioned the Greeks and the ancients, which include the Romans. So you see how he's pulling together so many things. Before I go on, let me just say this as a digression, and then we'll go back to the point. One of the great things about Pico, what I've learned mostly about Pico, the ideas are wonderful in themselves, and the expression is just wonderful. I was sold on classical rhetoric when I read this. But it's called sectarianism. What is that? It means that one can draw from all kinds of traditions using one's ingenuity. You can draw from all kinds of traditions. You don't have to shy away from like the Greeks or the pagans because they're pagan and they're not Christian. One of the great things about the Renaissance in general was this beautiful blending of this rebirth of pagan achievement. I mean, the word pagan has become a negative term now, but pagan just means not Christian. So if you turn to the ancient Greeks and Romans, that's not a bad thing. You can learn from them. That's why we study Plato and Aristotle and so on, and Cicero from Rome and so on. So one of the great achievements of Pico and all the Renaissance humanists, but Pico's perhaps one of the best representatives of this, is to draw from so many traditions, and not just a jack of all trades and master of none, but actually mastering these. I mean, when he draws from the ancient Greek tradition, he's reading in Greek. When he's drawing from the Old Testament, he's reading the Hebrew. And the best secondary texts in Hebrew are in Latin on the Hebrew text. And when he's reading the ancient Roman, like Cicero, he's reading it in Latin, and he's writing in Latin. So it's not like he's a jack of all trades and master of none, but drawing from many traditions and getting to the roots of these traditions and then pulling together into one synthetic vision. And this is philosophy at its best. Okay, so back to this idea here of the liberal arts. So we can say that for Pico, although the liberal arts in general are the vehicles through which humans are able to cultivate our nature, it's primarily by means of the two highest liberal arts, namely philosophy and theology, that humans are able to ascend to the point of being reborn. And I think he means the word reborn. He's giving new meaning, casting new meaning into the word reborn, as we find in the New Testament, reborn into divinity. Well, in my notes, and I don't know, I want to end this at least within an hour. So I'll stop. I may stop abruptly. In my notes, what I did was I went through paragraph by paragraph, and I just tried to pull out one of these three themes that was animating each paragraph. But I don't think that's necessary for us. Let me just give you a few. And some of these, since I've studied ancient Greek, and you have too in this course, if you've studied the Plato and Aristotle, you can see how especially Plato and Aristotle influenced Pico. Let's talk about his notion of freedom a little bit more. He says, not germs, like that's a bad word these days, whatever seeds you can cultivate, either consciously or unconsciously, the same will mature. So whatever you're doing over and over again, that's going to mature. That's why it's very important what images and what thoughts you have swimming around in your mind all the time. So if you cultivate only the vegetative seeds, which he gets from Aristotle, you remember when we talked about the soul, the way Aristotle, the idea of the soul, that the human soul contains within itself the vegetative soul. The vegetative soul can exist without humans. That's plants, right? But if you cultivate only the vegetative seeds, then you become like a vegetable, he says. If you cultivate only the sensual seeds, you become an animal, like a non-human animal. All this is right in Aristotle, right? But he doesn't mention Aristotle. He just takes it up, and you see how he pulls it into his own vision and makes Aristotle then express. He takes Aristotle ideas to express his own idea. That's the synthetic approach. If he cultivates the rational part, he becomes a heavenly being. If he cultivates the intellectual part, which is like the higher powers of reason, he will become a pure intelligence, like an angel, and the Son of God. But notice, angels and the Son of God, like the Son of God, it's not the ultimate yet. He wants to take it one more step. That's probably why the Inquisition found him guilty of unorthodox theses. They couldn't rise up to that kind of theology. He says, but if dissatisfied with the lot of all creatures, to move beyond our creaturely existence, he should recollect, only he divides the word, recollect himself. We can recollect ourselves into the center of our being, into that unity. That center is also the encompassing, and become one spirit with the Godhead. So this is his mysticism. So the dignity of humans reside in our freedom to transform our multitude nature from the lowest to the highest. And finally, to a higher divinity clothed with human flesh into the Godhead. The true dignity of man, therefore, is freedom to transform ourselves. So if you read the whole oration, it's really not that long. It's sort of like a 45-minute talk or something like that. You'll see he's using all kinds of metaphor and similes, drawing from so many sources, mostly from the Old Testament, from the New Testament, from the ancient Greeks and the Romans, and from his fellow Renaissance humanists. and the great theologians from the Middle Ages. But you won't find a more ecumenical thinker than Pico. So he takes these metaphors and imbues them with the meaning of his own idea, this vision that he has. He says, this is why the Chaldeans say man is a living creature of varied, multiform, and ever-changing nature. He's going to all these different, all over the place, the Chaldeans, everywhere, the Phoenicians. It is his power, his freedom to change his nature that constitutes his genuine dignity. Or in the 10th paragraph, he says, in order not to abuse this great gift of freedom, we must bend all of our efforts towards achieving oneness with the Godhead. But in order to do this, we must cultivate the dignity and glory of the seraphim, the cherubim, and the thrones. So these are like the three highest angels. And what he does, and I'll end on this, there's so much more, we could go on and on, but the point is, he's taking these images, and this is one of the characteristic modes of expression of medieval and Renaissance thinking is to use imagery and imaginative universals, universali fantastici. That means imaginative universals. So they're universal, but they're not concepts. They're images, like these three angels, the seraphim, the cherubim, and the thrones. So let's just look at that and see how he takes these three images and breathes into them the vision that he wants to articulate. How must we proceed? And what must we do to realize this ambition? We must do as they do and live as they live. But what is it that they do and how do they live? By they, he means these three highest angels. And so the seraphim, he associates, he says, the seraphim burns with the fire of charity. So we become then like the cherubim, we become lovers. But not just lovers like Romeo and Juliet, that too, but love in the widest sense, every sense of love, eros, agape, and what's the other kind of love? There's so many kinds of, it's not just eros, which is usually romantic or sensual love, or agape, which is the love of God. There's one more, eros, agape, and philos, which is like friendship, in the deep sense of friendship. So love in the widest sense, we become lovers like the cherubim. But the highest love then is love of the Creator. That's the seraphim. The cherubim flashes forth with the splendor of intelligence. So we become enlightened. We become aware of the source of our own intelligence. See, the intelligence reveals ideas and ultimate ideas. But what is the power that it allows the intelligence to reveal ideas? That's a hard one. Because as soon as we think about the origin of intelligence, then we objectify, we reify, we make a thing out of that origin. So it's hard to get a hold of it because you can't form a representation of it. But when we become aware of the very source of the power to reveal ideas, what is it that enlightens the mind, which is the tool that enlightens things? Then we become aware of that. We flash forth with the splendor of the cherubim, through contemplation of the Creator in his work and the work in the Creator. When we see God in all things and all things in God. One to one, there is no separation between ourselves and God. One from one, that means all things coming forth from God, like these rays of light coming forth from the sun. One in one, that means all things in God, because God is the encompassing. Nothing can be outside of this infinite encompassing God. All things are in God. And the mystical, the deeper insight is the one in one. What that means is that God is in all things. One to one from one in one. Let me try again. One to one, it means no separation between yourself and God. One from one, it means all things pouring forth from God. One in one, it means all things in God, and then the one, that is God, in one, in the little one. There's one with a capital O and one with a little o. One with the capital O is God. One with the little o are the many particular things. So let's try it one more time. One to one, that means no separation between the creator and creatures. One to one. Like when I say, I want to talk to you one to one, that means intimately, nothing between us. One from one means all things pouring forth from the Godhead, like sparks coming from a big wet fire. One in one means all things in God, because God is the encompassing. And then the one, that is the one with a capital O, in one, in all little things, even the mustard seed. So that's how we live like the cherubim. And then the throne, he says, stands firm with the firmness of justice. So we become activists for justice. So he's talking about being a citizen in the world, acting to create the conditions for justice. We become just in life. Love, light, and justice. So he's saying here that we should live this angelic life like the seraphim, the cherubim, and the throne. The dignity of a man is to freely emulate these poetic universals in order to attain Godhead, which is possible in this life. That's another thing, actually, that I like about the Renaissance. See, in ancient times, there was an emphasis on the art of living this life. It was all about this life. It was there was some talk about Hades and the afterlife, but people were not obsessed about that. What they were thinking about was how to live this life. And that was a salient aspect of ancient life. During the Middle Ages, there was this shift of emphasis to the next life, that this life was like only a stepping stone to the next life, the afterlife, which is better life. So all the emphasis was placed on just getting through this veil of tears, this suffering world that we have to go through, so that one day we can just be without suffering and be blissed out for eternity. There was this emphasis on the afterlife. But since there was this rebirth during the Renaissance of the ancient mentality, there was a return to both, actually. I mean, they weren't all like pagans, just rejecting the whole notion of heaven. I'm not saying that. But there was a return to this life, to how to live this life. And there is some, I don't want to get into polemics about what Christ meant when he said, I came to give you life and life more abundantly, because that was interpreted to mean how to live, and so that when you die, you can go to heaven. That's the main interpretation. You all know that. But there's another interpretation that may get a lot of people in trouble, but it could be that he was talking about how to live this life fully. So anyhow, that's an aside. So there's so many other metaphors that he uses, and he mentions particular liberal arts and how they function to transform someone. He gives a detailed discussion of Jacob's ladder from the from the Bible and interprets it in his own way. But those are the three main themes in the oration. And so it speaks directly to the question about human nature. I mean, of all the philosophers we're going to study, this one is the most apropos to the question, what does it mean to be human? To be human means to be made in indeterminate image with all the seeds of all the creatures. And then the great dignity of man lies in our ability to freely develop ourselves into any direction we choose. That's our freedom. So our dignity lies in our freedom. And then the liberal arts then become the vehicles that can take us there. That's the threefold thesis. And then the other thing that's important is this. I mean, there are a lot of other themes we could have talked about, but those are the three main ones. And each other theme is going to animate those three themes. Like, for example, I want to end just on this. There was a pre-Socratic philosopher, his name was Thales. He's like the first philosopher we know of. And we don't even have his fragments, any fragments from him. We only have like ancient philosophers quoting people who quoted him, you know. But we know that he was one of the 7 sages of ancient Greece. And one of the things he was reported to have said is, know thyself, know thyself. And it was inscribed in Delphi, which was a religious center in ancient Greece. And actually I went to Delphi once and I saw the inscription in ancient Greek, know thyself. And then right next to it says, nothing to excess, you know, and don't commit the crime of hubris, overweening pride. And those two ideas go together. But Pico interprets know thyself in this way, that if you could know yourself, then you could know all beings, because all beings are contained, at least in principle, not literally, of course, right? But in principle, all beings are contained in yourself. Like we started talking about, all 4 elements, all the elements, but in ancient times there were only 4. Air is our breath, you know, fire is our temperature, water is our fluids in our bodies, the liquid in our bodies, and our flesh and bones are made of matter, earth, stardust. And then we have a mind, and there's also a cosmic mind. And we have intelligence. There's a cosmic intelligence. Then we have a sense of I am. We have an ego. Some people's egos get bigger than they should. I am. Here I am. That's my ego. And then there's a cosmic I am. So all this microcosm that is ourself is in the macrocosm. So if we could just know ourselves, we would know all things. Know thyself, and nothing to excess. And so he interprets it his own way. Oh, he goes into the patience of Job and the spirituality of Job, and there's just so much more. I feel a little funny about not, and there's so much more in the liberal arts too. That's a topic I would urge you to study a little bit. At first, just listen to what the people like Pico say about the dignity of the liberal arts, because a lot of people don't really understand the value of the liberal arts. And if you don't understand the value of it, then you're not going to cultivate that. You know, just because like some people just don't even go to college. They say, well, I can make just as much money. I can make more money, you know, going to work and making a business. I don't need to go to college. I can make more money just working. And but then the whole question is, it's not all about making money either. I mean, that's important. Like Aristotle says, wealth is a necessary but not a sufficient condition for happiness. You know, it's important. We can't just throw the prudence to the wind. But it's not all about money, right? So there's other reasons why we might want to cultivate ourselves. There's different philosophies of education. Okay, so that's enough on Pico. He's one of my favorite thinkers. And this little oration on the dignity of man is just a little gem. And do yourself a favor, just read however much I assigned for you to read. But someday you may want to read the whole thing. and give it some thought and take it to heart. It's not that long, and it's worth reading. All right, so that's our. We'll move on. Bye.